I met the Soviet airplane at Le Bourget. I saw several cosmonauts. I recognized their faces. They got off, but I had no idea who it would be.
That was our first meeting. The crews weren't yet decided. On our side, there was Chatalov, Leonov, myself, Filipchenko, and Kubasov. We were all in the dark about the flight. We saw the mock-ups of our vessels. We examined each other's ship. There were friendly meetings, but everyone was itching to know the final makeup of our crew.
Later that evening, over in a little reception they gave in one of their hotel rooms they were staying, they broke out the vodka, the caviar, all that. They told us who the crew would be.
For the Soviet leaders, there was no contest. Alexei Leonov would command Soyuz. Back in 1960, the kid from Siberia was one of the 20 Soviet Air Force pilots selected to become a cosmonaut. In March 1965, he achieved legendary status by becoming the first person to walk in space. "40-year-old Valery Kubasov would be the flight engineer alongside Alexei Leonov. He knew Soyuz intimately from having flown in 1969. 2 astronauts would accompany Thomas Stafford in the Apollo module. Designated backup crewman on Apollo 15, this time the American Vance Brand wouldn't remain on the touchline and would undertake his first spaceflight. Next to him was Deke Slayton. Selected in 1958 for the Mercury program, he was grounded because of a heart condition and had never experienced the joys of weightlessness. He would pilot the docking module for the Apollo-Soyuz mission. For perfect equality between the two countries, the mission logo was designed to be read in both directions: Soyuz Apollo in the USSR, Apollo Soyuz in the USA. Preparation for this first international mission could begin. The Soviet Academy of Sciences and NASA would take care of organizing the various meetings. In early autumn 1973, though the global political backdrop was fairly chaotic, instructions to astronauts, cosmonauts, engineers, and technicians on both sides were clear. In order to work together effectively, it was time to shelve the ideologies.
My first impressions, it gave me the jitters. We were off to a developed country with top-notch specialists in their field. Would my knowledge and my capacities match up, or would they crush us with their intellectual capacities and their resources?
The American delegation had a similar taste of otherness when journeying to Moscow for their first stay on enemy soil.
Астронавтам очень понравился музей. Они были приятно удивлены, осмотрев раздел, посвященный освоению космоса в Соединенных Штатах Америки.
The Russian people were very interested in my experience of walking on the moon. And we were very careful when we talked about this to not say anything that was bragging.
At first, you know, the conditions of the world being what they were at the time, there was probably suspicion on both sides about motives and other things. But we made a point of sticking to, we were interested in what applied to the Apollo-Soyuz flight.
That was also the conviction shared and passed on to the teams by the Soviet technical director, his counterpart, Dr. Konstantin Bushiev.
We never talked politics. We were professional, you know. They were professional test pilots. We were professional test pilots.
For the American delegation, the disorientation was total.
Все, кто приезжает в Москву, стремятся прийти сюда, к мавзолею Владимира Ильича Ленина, основателя Коммунистической партии и создателя социалистического государства.
But similarities often hide behind the dissimilarities.
Около мавзолея в Кремлевской стене покоится прах людей, кто среди первых штурмовал космос.
We were careful never to compare the United States and the Soviet Union. We didn't compare our television, programs. We didn't compare the food you could buy in the stores. We didn't compare anything. And they didn't do that to us either.
The American team listened attentively to the Russian delegation, which unveiled part of Soyuz's secrets. The astronauts noted in particular that the guidance and navigation systems of the Russian module were totally different to those used on Apollo. Throughout the meetings, other incompatibilities arose, all requiring solutions that they must find together to allow the vessels to dock.
Пожалуйста, Том, читайте первый параграф.
Да.
First of all, cosmonauts and astronauts would have to settle a sizable problem.
Мы живем в Одессе.
That of communication. Each crew would learn the other's language. We started out, the baseline was each crew would speak their own language, and the other crew would have to understand. But after about 6 months of working back and forth, it was going very slow.
До линия.
До линия.
Valley.
До линия реки Волги. Из окна.
And one night, what they call in Russian, a вечеринка, means a little reception. Always a U-shaped table with caviar, vodka, all that. The backup commander, Anatoly Filipchenko, we were trying to talk. It was like ESP, it came to both of us, about the same time. I said, look, I speak Russian to you, you speak English to me. I bet we understand each other better. Because if you're not extremely fluent in a foreign language, you will speak it slower, and you will speak it more distinctly.
Итак, очередной этап подготовки к совместному полету закончен. Американские астронавты улетают на родину. Впереди встреча в Хьюстоне. Доброго вам пути!
Despite the various cooperation agreements signed between the Soviet and American leaders, the invisible forces of the KGB and the CIA continued gathering information. The Cold War was still in the news, and these exchanges were particularly monitored. For Seymour Liebergut, radio operator in the control room, this trip to the USSR was a chance to see behind the curtain.
The Russians were very paranoid about security. And as a matter of fact, I was warned by Bob Overmeyer, one of our astronauts that stayed over there during the mission. Bob said, the Hotel Rosia has 3,000 rooms. He says you have to get used to the fact that all of them are bugged. They all have eavesdropping. And if you need clean sheets or a towel, open the doors on the armoire and say, I need more towels. And they'll be there the next morning. And we saw all that. We saw the short men with the long coats and fedora hats that followed us around when we were over there. It's for our protection, of course, right?
Everyone wanted to know how sincere the other side was. Everyone wanted to know if, by chance, the other side wasn't doing all this for espionage reasons rather than political rapprochement.
At the time, the Russians were extremely handicapped in the field of information technology in particular, as in the field of electronics. So one thing the Americans guarded jealously was that the Russians, at the time the Soviets, should not profit from any unwitting technology transfers.
As you can imagine, the Russians were briefed by the KGB and the Americans by the CIA before the mission. Each had to know what should be talked about and what should not.
I'd like to introduce to you our honored guest this And we watch these young men, these representatives of us, from two cultures, as they learn to work together.
Gray matter was not enough to ensure the success of such a mission. Each astronaut had to prepare like an athlete, even if they were only part of the backup crew, like Vladimir Zhanibekov. Age 32, he was at the beginning of a very long career as a cosmonaut.
The first time we arrived at NASA, there was a sign saying, "Beware, the Russians are coming." Right next to me, the door was open. There was a blackboard on which someone had drawn a space shuttle. And from its hold, bombs were falling onto a map of Russia. We laughed, of course, but the memory stayed with me.
1 year before the start of the mission, the two crews gathered in Houston where they trained on mock-ups and simulators. Together, they would have to draw up a precise mission schedule.
Then the question arose of where the two crews should meet. How many dockings? Who goes first? We all fought to be first. Konstantin Bushiev, who had diplomatic training, convinced the Americans, with his characteristic gentle insistence, that the Soviet Union should leave first.
Finally, after long negotiations, it was decided that on July 15, 1975, the Soyuz rocket would take off first and ignite the media interest, one of the main objectives of this mission. And the teams on the ground certainly got the picture. For the first time, the American Apollo spacecraft would carry 4 state-of-the-art portable video cameras and a VCR recorder.
You know, I pioneered color TV on Apollo 10. I won an Emmy. And so it was TV had become a very important just to share with the public because they're the taxpayers, they pay for it. I pushed for all the TV we could get because we wanted to show the rest of the world what we were doing.
In the case of the Soyuz, it was the first publicly live televised launch of a spacecraft. Everything had been kept and embargoed until they were certain that they were successful. So it was very important to the Soviet people as well as to the world.
By 1974, NASA had lost its luster. Manned space flights no longer fired the crowd's imagination, and part of American public opinion held that these flights were no longer useful and cost too much. So the National Aeronautics and Space Administration were keen to make an impression with Apollo-Soyuz. The keynote image of this mission would be the handshake between Alexei Leonov and Thomas Stafford. However hearty the handshake, it would cost NASA the equivalent of $1 billion of today's dollars.
They practiced that handshake 1,000 times. They rehearsed with models. They also worked on their speeches to have at least a base to work from. But what do you want? It's all a bit like theater.
Okay. Я думаю, that скоро я открываю loop 3. How are you, Alexei?
I'm well. Glad to see you.
There were lots of debates. In the end, it was agreed that the meeting should take place between the airlock and the Soyuz service compartment. The staging was rather artificial. It was cramped and difficult to film in that spot. Impossible to get interesting shots for television. We wouldn't get beautiful pictures. We had to film at an angle so as not to distort the image.
Well, the handshake was very important because that was the symbolic meeting in space. The handshake is a universal gesture of comradeship and openship, revealing that you are unarmed, you're holding out your hand in greeting.
When the Soviet crew would be in the United States, all different crew members would have them to their house for dinner, and the engineers too. All that, so we developed a very close relationship.
In the United States, I want to visit Hollywood.
Alexei Leonov, Soyuz commander.
Because I want to be a movie star.
Colonel in the Soviet Air Force.
No, I don't want. Tom Stafford want.
Leonov and Stafford built a very tight relationship. It was actually because Leonov is a very personable person, a guy that has a real personality. He likes to laugh. He likes to do things that he never seen. He likes to test you. And Stafford was more an upright guy. But Leonov's attitude kind of broke his tough spirit and made him more human.
The two commanders will be flying two very different vessels. The Apollo craft was developed for lunar missions, so Apollo had extensive maneuverability and great flight autonomy. The astronauts could live in it for almost 30 days in total autonomy. Soyuz was less sophisticated than Apollo, and its smaller fuel storage capacity prevented it from flying at altitudes higher than 1,300 kilometers. But Soyuz had already demonstrated that its automatic docking system worked when handling hookups in space. Today, the Russian module has become a taxicab for the International Space Station.